Hey, Math 3 honors, this is Sensei. All right, I got another lesson for you. We're going to be doing more graphing trigonometry. Guess what? We're going to be doing amplitude. And we're also going to be doing phase shift. No, not phase shift. But anyway, you'll see. So, but first, before we get started, guess what? I have been working on some more magic tricks. This is the biggest magic trick I've ever done. It's like nothing up my sleeve. You're not even going to believe this when you see this, okay? So, all right, here we go. This takes a lot of concentration. But before I start this magic trick, you know, this is 2020 if you're watching this in the future. We're actually quarantined right now. So we need some protection. Before I start this magic trick, I'm going to keep you protected. I want to keep me protected. So in order to do that, I got to wear my face mask here. So here we go. Got my face mask. Okay, there. Everything's good. Okay. Now, also, if you little know, the coronavirus can spread to the eyes. So I want to do some eye protection here before I do my magic trick. Okay, we're doing good. Okay, now, if you ever know this, you can also get the coronavirus in the ears. So I'm going to go ahead and protect my ears. That way I am fully protected here. All right. Okay, focusing all my power. Here we go. Focusing everything I got. And bam!
Whoa, I'm a woman. Bam!
Whoa, that was the weirdest thing. Oh my gosh. I just became a woman. I never thought that would happen. Well, anyway, that was the trick. No, there was no camera tricks, nothing up my sleeve. That was just pure, good old-fashioned magic. All right, so you guys ready to start some math? All right, so we are going to go to graphing sine and cosine. We're not going to be doing tangent. We're going to be doing graphing sine and cosine, all right? So, again, hopefully you got my message about how to complete my class. I sent it before, but we need some pencils. Ruler? Yes, get one. Graph paper, of course. Unit circle, bring it out, okay? So, here we go. By the way, don't try to change into a woman at home. It's very dangerous, because you might stay that way, okay? Or a woman, don't try to be a man, all right? Not recommended unless you know what you're doing. All right, so let's get to work. I'm going to get my setup here, and we are going to do some math. Let's rock and roll. Okay, I have about 4 functions I would like to graph with you today. Okay? Now, the first one I'd like to do is y equals 2 times sine of x. Now, this 2 is actually the a, but in functions, in trigonometric functions, we call that the amplitude. Remember, what does the a do before? The a stretches or compresses. Well, same, it's like totally the exact same idea here. Okay, so let's go ahead and work these out. Now, go ahead and copy this table, copy the graph. Before you get started with me, you need to have that all copied. Make sure you're out of bed, make sure you're doing all this. And what do you think this 2 does to our function? Okay, notice it is outside of the sign. So what we're going to do is we are going to plug in our function, get the sign, and then multiply our answer by 2. Okay, so we plug in x, we'll get the sign, and then we multiply by 2 in order of operations. So let's do this one at a time, just to see what it does. So let's do y equals sine, let me rewrite that better. Y equals 2 times sine of x. Let's plug in 0. Okay, get your unit circle out. What is sine of 0? So we go here. Remember, sine is the y value. Sine of 0 is 0. So then we say 2 times 0 is 0. Okay, so the sine of 0 is 0. Okay. Now what about pi over 2? What do we got there? Y equals 2 times sine. Let's plug in pi over 2. Okay, so now what do we do first? We find the sine of pi over 2. So we go here, pi over 2. What's my sine? It's the y value. It's 1. So sine of pi over 2 is 1. What's 2 times 1? 2. So we got there, it is 2. Okay, now let's do sine of pi. Okay, well, y equals 2 times sine, of pi. Okay, what's the sine of pi? Well, we go here, pi is 0. Sine of pi is 0, so 2 times 0 is 0. Okay, so when we plug in pi, we get 0 there, so we get 0. Now what about 3 pi over 2? Well, let's look at our unit circle. We have here 3 pi over 2. What's my sign? -1. Sorry, let's write it out. Y equals 2 times sine of, okay, we said put in, what do we say? 3 pi over 2. Sine of 3 pi over 2 was -1, which is what we said before. 2 times -1 is -2. Sine of 2 pi. Okay, now guess what? We're going to go back around the circle. Y equals 2 times sine of 2 pi. Can you see that there? 2 pi. Okay, sine of 2 pi is, we go whoop, right here, 0. So we plug in 0. 2 times 0 is 0. Okay, so we're back at 0 again. And guess what? The pattern is going to keep continuing. 5 pi over 2. Well, 5 pi over 2, well, let's write it down here. Y equals 2 times sine 5 pi over 2. What's 5 pi over 2? Remember, we go all the way around once, and then we add another pi over 2 to my 2 pi, and we get back here. And my sine is 1. So y equals 2 times 1, which is, again, 2. Y equals, whoops, here we go, y equals 2. And you could start seeing the pattern here. Guess what? 3 pi. Okay, remember? We go around to 2 pi, add another pi. 3 pi is right here. My sign is 0. So 0. Anyway, you should know, I don't know, hopefully you're starting to see the pattern here. So sine of 3 pi. Sine of, sorry, there we go. Sine of 3 pi, again, is 0. So we say 2 times 0 is 2. I'm sorry, 2 times 0 is, come on, sensei. 2 times 0 is what? 0. Sorry, I saw that mistake there. And guess what? 7 pi over 2. There we go. Y equals 2 times sine of 7 pi over 2. 7 pi over 2. We go all the way around to 3 pi. Add another 2 pi. 7 pi over 2. Sine is -1. And so it's 2 times -1, which is -2. And we go here at -2. And then 4 pi will be back at 0. Okay, anyway, you guys figure that one out. I'm just over this all. Okay, here we go. So, before we graph that, I'm going to graph sine of x, okay? Now, the unit circle says sine of 0 is 0. Sine of pi over 2 is 1. Sine of pi, we go back down to 0. 3 pi over 2 is negative 1. 2 pi, we go back up at 0. Then guess what? 5 pi over 2, we go back up. 3 pi, we go back down. 2 pi, we go up. And we go here. Now, here is my sine function. This is not the function we were graphing. Anyway, practice graphing that. That's y equals sine of x. Okay? This is sine of x. Now, y equals 2 times sine of x. What just happened here? We have here 0 is 0. Pi over 2, what do we got? 2. Pi, we're back at 0. 3 pi over 2, we're back down to negative 2. 2 pi, we're at 0. 5 pi over 2, we're at 2. 3 pi, 0. 7 pi over 2, we're at, where are we at? Negative 2, and then back at 0. Now, look carefully, and can you tell me what just happened? Make sure you do curves, no V's. Has to be curvy. I will take points off if you do V's. Look what happened here. This is called the amplitude, or we could see it as the stretch. You can see normally sine goes up to 1, but when we multiply by 2, it's exactly the same, except we stretched everything out to 2 and negative 2. And so we can say our amplitude is 2. All right? The amplitude is equal to 2. Boom. That's from 0. That's half the size of the function. All right, there you go. Let's do another one where we have the a. Okay, but guess what? Instead of doing 2, let's do 1/2 cosine of x. Okay, we'll do cosine, instead of 2, we're doing half. Can you predict what you think's going to happen this time, right, compared to the last one? So let's go ahead and calculate the function. Probably going to go a little bit quicker on calculating all this stuff on this one. So I guess bear with me here. I guess if I go too fast, you can always pause it. But now we're saying y equals 1/2 cosine of 0. Now remember, cosine is different than sine. Cosine is the y, is the x. Sine is the y. Okay. Cosine of 0 is 1. So it's 1/2 times 1. What's 1/2 times 1? Well, guess what? It is 1/2. Boom. Okay. Y equals 1/2 cosine of pi over 2. What is cosine pi over 2? Cosine pi over 2 is 0. So we say 1/2 times 0 is 0. So we got a 0 there. Cosine y equals 1/2. What's the next x we're going to plug in? Pi. Cosine of pi. Cosine of pi is -1. 1/2 times -1. What is that? -1/2. Interesting. -1/2. 3 pi over 2. Remember, I'm also plotting all my zeros and ones. I don't want to plot these. I want to get my zeros and ones. 3 pi over 2, cosine is 0. Y equals 1/2 cosine 3 pi over 2, which is 1/2 times 0, which is 0. Okay, so we got 0. 2 pi. Y equals 1/2 cosine 2 pi. Cosine 2 pi. 2 pi is 1. So 1/2 times 1 is 1/2. 5 pi over 2. We go back up. Okay. Cosine y equals cosine 1/2 cosine times 5 pi over 2. 5 pi over 2, we go back up here, we go back up at 0. 1/2 times 0 is 0. And again, some of you are saying, Sensei, we don't need to do all this. I see the pattern, right? Go back up, down. I want to go back to -1/2. But anyway, let's go. 3 pi. Y equals 1/2 cosine 3 pi. Remember 3 pi, we go over here. 2 pi, add another pi. We're at 3 pi, -1. So 1/2 times -1 is -1/2. 7 pi over 2, we're back at 0. Y equals 1/2 cosine 7 pi over 2. That we're at again, which is at 0. I mean, look here, it's right here. 0. Go twice around the circle. 1/2 times 0 is 0. And then the last one you figured out, it's at 1/2. Okay, so now let's graph the cosine first. Okay, so you could see the change, but maybe you can guess what the idea is now. But cosine of 0 is 1. Cosine of pi over 2 is 0. Cosine of pi is -1. Cosine of 3 pi over 2 is 0. Cosine of 2 pi, we're back at 1. Cosine of 5 pi over 2, we're back at 0. Cosine of 3 pi, we're down at -1. 7 pi, 0. 4 pi, 1. Okay, here's my cosine function. Make sure you do curves. No V's. Curves. Okay? This is cosine of x. Now, let's look at our table and graph 1/2 cosine of x. We'll do it in green. So we got the green here. Green, green. Okay. 0 is 1/2. Pi over 2 is 0. Pi is -1/2. 3 pi over 2, 0. 2 pi, 1/2. 5 pi over 2, 0. 3 pi, -1/2. 7 pi over 2, 0. And 4 pi is 1/2. Make sure we go curves, not V's. Curves. Now, what just happened there? That just happened, Sensei. Cosine 1/2, 1/2 cosine of x. But look at, the amplitude was cut in half for this reason, right? It's now a half. And so it's the exact same as cosine, except now our amplitude is, we would call that the amplitude. Amplitude is 1/2. Obviously, we get that from that. Okay. Okay, so anyway, let's take a little break. As you take the break, I'm going to play some violin for you. Just make sure you put your chin on the chin protector. That's what that is. And the thing about violin is you have to make sure when you're playing it, you have to know your tones. Like, I'm going to play an A right now. You have to know your tones. Here we go. Hang on a second. Hang on a second here. The violin's kind of out of tune. I'm going to tune it up. Here we go. Hey. Hey. Do, re, mi, fa, so. I think the lights are flickering because of my awesome music. Have you ever seen someone play so amazing that the lights flicker? This is my G. It's all about the action. the action of the bow. Okay, so now I want you to practice because I'm teaching you how to play the violin and how to do math. I'm gonna do a quick seven note strut here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Make it high. 5, 6, 7. Okay. Anyway, let's get back to some math. Okay. All right. Rocky road. Okay. Now we have 2 more to do. Okay. So after all that, now these are tough. So I don't know if you're burnt out, you need to take a little bit of a break. You might want to come back and watch the rest of this. I think this is a long part of the video, but this is the B. Okay, here's the B. Let's go ahead and see what that does. Okay, what it's going to do, it's going to multiply by the X, and then actually let's do the 2X before we do the fractions. I don't like fractions. Let's do the 2X, this B. Okay, this is going to multiply by the X, and then you get the sine. Okay, now look at my X coordinates here. You can see actually I cut them in half, and you'll see why in just a second. Instead of pi over 2, I did in between pi over 2, I did pi over 4. What's that going to do? Well, let's go ahead and start plugging these in and see. Okay. Y equals sine of 2 times x. Okay, so let's plug in 0. So what this means is I multiply by 2 and then I get my sine. So what's 2 times 0? Is 0. So I get sine of 0. Remember the sine is the y, which is 0. And I got 0 here. Okay. Now, notice I did this pi over 4. Okay, I went in between. Why did I do that? Y equals sine times 2 times pi over 4. Well, what that does is I have to multiply 2 times my pi over 4, which becomes 2 pi over 4, or it becomes pi over 2. So now, when I plug in pi over 4, it actually becomes, I'm really getting the sine of pi over 2. So think about that. Instead of pi over 4, now I'm getting the pi over 2. So sine of pi over 2 is 1, which I have here, 1, which should have been my pi over 2. Now I get pi over 2, I'm going to double that. What happens when you double pi over 2? Okay, well, let's go over here. Y equals sine of 2 times pi over 2. Well, I multiply 2 times pi over 2. Those cancel out, and I get pi. So now instead of pi over 2, now I'm really getting the sine of pi. Remember, so now it's 0. Okay? Sine of pi is 0. Instead of pi over 2, I'm getting pi. Okay, so now 3 pi over 4, which, if you think about it, 3 pi over 4 is right here. I'm going in between, right? Instead of going, what I'm doing is I'm getting the sine of the 45 degrees. 5 pi over 4, I'll get 5 pi over 4, 3 pi over 2, because I'm doubling it. What is 3 pi over 2? Now let's plug in the 3 pi over 2. So you double the 3 pi over 2, y equals sine times 2 times 3 pi over 2. The 2's are going to cancel out. 3 pi. Okay, so now I get my sine of 3 pi, which is, oh, I'm sorry, misread. That's 3 pi over 4. I went a little fast. It seemed kind of odd. Let's do this again. Sorry. Y equals, just like regular class, and Sensei makes a mistake, 2 times 3 pi over 4, which is sine of 6 pi over 4, but that's going to reduce to 3 pi over 2. So now I'm really getting 3 pi over 2. That makes much more sense. Which is here, right here, and my sine is -1. Okay? Now, sine of pi. So I multiply pi by 2. Guess what happens when you multiply pi by 2? Okay, y equals sine of 2 times, what am I putting here? Pi. Multiply pi times 2, guess what I get? 2 pi. So now instead of getting the sine of pi, I'm getting really the sine of 2 pi, whoop, which is here, I'm at 0. Now 5 pi over 4, so I'm actually adding pi over 2 to that. What's 5 pi over 4? 5 pi over 4. Actually, yeah, I'm getting the sine. Remember, I went 5 pi over 4. I'm getting the sine of this. But I multiply that by 2. Y equals sine of 2 times 5 pi over 4, which, is going to be 10 pi over 4 or 5 pi over 2. Now, what's 5 pi over 2? 5 pi over 2 would be back here, and then I go up here. 5 pi over 2 would be this. We go back around the circle. We're at 1 again. And you can start seeing the pattern, right? 0, 1, 0, negative 1, 0, 1, back down to 0, negative 1, right? Anyway, those of you who see the pattern, just do the pattern. I'll keep calculating it. Y equals 3 pi over 2 times, y equals sine of 2 times 3 pi over 2, which it'll be 3 pi. Now 3 pi, remember, we go all the way around to 2 pi, add another pi, we get 3 pi. Sine is 0. Okay? Now you can keep calculating that out, 0, and go back down to negative 1, then I'll go back up to 0. That's it. Okay, so what does that do? Let's first graph sine to see what that looks like. Remember, sine, we start at 0. Pi over 2, we're at 1. Pi, we go back down to 0. 3 pi, notice my scaling is a lot different on this one. 3 pi over 2, we go down to negative 1. And then I go back up to 2 pi, which would be right here. Sorry, I didn't extend that. So here's my sine of x. Remember, curves, no v's, curves. There's my sine. Notice I had to stretch it out because look at my graph because I wanted to fit this in. Anyway, this is sine of x. Now, what if I multiplied it by 2? We have 0, pi over 4, we're at 1. Pi over 2, I'm down to 0. 3 pi over 4, I'm at negative 1. Pi, I'm at 0. 5 pi over 4, I'm at 1. Notice I did one complete revolution of the circle at pi, right? 3 pi over 2, 0. 7 pi over 4, negative 1, 2 pi, 0. So, curves, no v's. So what that 2 does in front of the x, it actually makes it spin faster, right? This is sine of 2x. I just increased my spins. Went that much faster. Okay? I completed a whole period, a whole revolution at pi, when it normally takes me to go around the circle up to 2 pi. But since I'm multiplying by 2, I actually get around the circle. This is my 2 pi. Okay? So, if you can guess, and we'll do cosine, y equals 1/2 cosine of x. This will be the last one, and then we'll be done. Okay? So, what's this doing? Notice what I did here is my intervals are different because I'm going to be cutting each of these in half. Pi is going to equal to pi over 2. 2 pi is going to equal to pi. 3 pi will equal to 3 pi over 2. Do those numbers sound familiar? Pi is going to equal to 2 pi. Anyway, let's go ahead and plug those in so you can see. And by the way, tomorrow or next time I'll be showing you a faster way to be graphing all of these. By the way, good luck on your AP exams, this will be the only lesson I give you guys this week. So, okay, cosine 1/2 times 0. Remember, cosine is my x, sine is my y. So 1/2 times 0 is 0. So y equals, now you're going to get the cosine of 0, which is, cosine of 0 is 1. Or that's my y. Okay. Cosine y equals cosine of 1/2 times pi. First one. What's half of pi? Cosine of pi over 2. Which now, instead of pi, I'm going right here at pi over 2. And my cosine is 0. Okay, so I got 0. Y equals cosine of 1/2 times 2 pi. Half of 2 pi is going to be pi. What's cosine of pi? Cosine of pi is -1. Okay, so we got -1. 3 pi. So now we're getting half of 3 pi. Cosine 1/2 of 3 pi. 3 pi divided by 2. And then guess where we're at? We're at our good old 3 pi over 2. Cosine is 0. Okay? Half of 4 pi is 2 pi. Okay, well, half of 4 pi is cosine 1/2 of 4 pi. What's half of 4 pi? 2 pi. Okay, which is 4 pi, 2 pi is 1. And then we're going to go back around, right? 5 pi. Y equals cosine 1/2 of 5 pi, which would be cosine of 5 pi over 2. So cosine of 5 pi over 2, we go around the circle and we go back here, boom, we're at 0 again. Okay, guess what? We're going to be back at -1. But this will be the last one I'll calculate, and then the rest you'll just figure out the pattern, okay? Y equals cosine 1/2 of, what's next? 6 pi. What's half of 6 pi? 3 pi. And then 3 pi is going to be on the unit circle, -1, because we go around once, add pi, we got 3 pi, we got -1. Guess we go back up to 0, then we go back over to 1. Figure that out. Okay, now, in order, you can put whatever you want here, but I want these to calculate to my 0s and 1s. And I know if I get half of 0 is 0. I know if I get half of pi, I pick pi because I get half of pi, I'll get pi over 2, which will get me back up to that 1, right? I want to kind of reverse calculate. Now, there's going to be another way I'll show you how to do this next time, like I said, but let's see, what does that do? Let's look at our cosine of x. Cosine of x. Cosine of 0 is 1. Cosine of pi over 2 is 0. Cosine of pi is -1. Cosine of 3 pi over 2. Wait, hang on a second here. What am I doing? Cosine of 0 is 1. Cosine of pi over 2 is 0. Cosine of pi is -1. 3 pi over 2 is 0. Cosine of 2 pi is 1. And then we just keep going. Cosine of 5 pi over 2, we go back down to 0. Cosine of 3 pi, we go down to -1. 7 pi over 2, we go back to 0. 4 pi, we go up to 1. 0. You can see the pattern. Just keep going up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. Now, I didn't need to go all this. 7 pi. I guess it's so you can see. And 1. Anyway, cosine, we have, boom. There's 1 period, went around the circle once. Boom. There's 2 periods, then back up. 3 periods. 4 periods. Now, if we do the 1/2, it's going to make us go around the circle slower. So 0 is 1. Pi is 0. 2 pi, I got -1. 3 pi, I go back up to 0. 4 pi, I go back up to 1. 5 pi, I go down to 0. 6 pi, go down to -1. 7 pi, I go back up to 0. And 8 pi, I go up to 1. Now watch this. Go up. Up. Boom. There's 1 period. What happened? Cosine did 2 periods when it takes 1/2 cosine 1/2 times x. It takes it 4 pi to go around the circle. Then go here, another period. And again, make sure you do circles. There's my cosine of 1/2 x compared to my cosine of x. It takes it half the time to go around. All right. So look, by the time it got around 2 times, the cosine of x went around the circle 4 times there. And that's how you graph those. That is what you got to do. Okay, so that's it. That was a long video, so hopefully this all processes. I'll be pretty, Anyway, so hope you guys are doing well. Study those AP exams. This This is Sensei signing out. We're graphing trigonometry. By the way, school ends June 5th. You're done June 5th. June 5th is the last day of school for 2020. Coronavirus. All right. See you later.